In this episode of Motive Garage presented by Sparesbox, we're upgrading the transmission in our 8-second R32 GT-R. All right, don't stress out. We're not converting to auto or DCT in our GT-R. We are staying manual. We're just upgrading to a newer version of our PPG sequential transmission. Now, for a lot of GT-R owners, having a sequential gearbox in the car is the dream. It certainly has been for mine since I got into GT-Rs back in 1999. Now, I'm lucky enough that I've had a PPG 6-speed sequential in our GT-R since 2017. Straight after we put it in, the car went straight into the 9s and became the quickest stock bottom end GT-R at the time.
Yeah, that's it.
Now, as well as having a sequential in my GT-R, I've also driven probably every single brand of sequential transmission that you can put into an R32 GT-R. So I've certainly earned the right to compare them and comment on the pros and cons of each sequential. So if I've already got a sequential transmission in my GT-R, why am I changing it? And is there anything wrong with the old one? No, it's been in the car since 2017. It's done hundreds of drag passes, it's done hundreds of roll racing hits, hundreds of dyno runs, and done somewhere north of 7,000 kilometers of driving, hard driving at that. The gearbox has been fantastic. I've raved about how good the PPG sequential is to drive on the street many times in our videos, but it hasn't let me down while racing since 2017. And when we had it out recently to get a check over and a refresh, there was only a couple of small items that needed to be replaced, but more preventative maintenance like any race car would do after a certain amount of kilometers. The proof of how good it is, well, it did 3 8-second passes back to back and went as quick as 860 at 165 miles per hour. So, if it ain't broke, why fix it? With the car getting a big overhaul and freshen up before it heads to the USA, we know it's going to do a lot of racing between GT-R Festival in Texas, this versus that, media stunts and features, TX2K 2025, and who knows what else, plus it'll be on display at SEMA and some other car shows. So talking with Tom and Dave at PPG, we all decided that the car should be showcasing the latest and greatest from PPG, their Billet 6-speed sequential transmission for RB. With my old stock casing sequential and my Billet sequential both side by side before they get installed into cars, I thought it would be a good opportunity to compare them and discuss which one suits what purpose. The 6-speed sequential gear set uses the factory transmission casing. You can see the front section here and the middle section that goes to the transfer case, but it does use a billet sandwich plate in between. That and the build stickers are basically the only thing that give away that this gearbox is anything special. Obviously, being a factory casing means it bolts straight into the car, straight into the factory shifter position, and to most people looks factory from underneath, except this pretty blue pit, of course. Inside though, nothing remains factory. The helical cut dog engagement gear set sits on billet shafts with 26 spline GM size input shaft for extra strength. There's the dog gears, the bearings, the nitrided steel selector forks, all from PPG and all high quality material made in South Australia. It comes with the sequential lever with load cell plus a gill blade 360-degree sensor to enable closed loop flat shifting. It comes with the gear display and all the wiring you need. Being helical cut as opposed to straight cut means the PPG sequential gear set isn't overbearingly noisy. I mean, I love the sound of race cars, but if you want to drive on the street, helical cut is the way to go. But on the flip side, there is just enough gearbox noise to let you know that you've got something serious underneath the car, which I personally think you have to have when you're spending this sort of money on a transmission, but at the same time, you don't have to yell to talk over the straight cut gears. The dog gears inside this box are really well designed. This has to be probably the smoothest and nicest shifting dog box you can get, making it suitable for a street car. Now, you'll never get rid of the rocking on the dogs on and off light throttle, but this combined with the closed loop flat shift means you can use 2 fingers to do perfect gear changes, even at low RPM, low boost settings, but a nice aggressive shift at high RPM, as observed in our car in plenty of videos. So there's no disadvantages as per se with this sequential setup. It's more that there's advantages to the Billet sequential. So let's go take a look at that. So here it is, the Billet 6-speed sequential transmission from Fitzner Performance Gearboxes. Firstly, I will say this. What a good looking piece of equipment, and knowing what it does makes it even prettier. God, I love billet stuff. There's so much of it going in this car now. Essentially, the inside of this gearbox is pretty much the same as inside the other one, except for a few small differences. It does basically have the same helical cut dog engagement 6-speed transmission gear set, but obviously it has it inside a billet casing, which has a lot of advantages. Having a custom designed gearbox meant it doesn't need to use any press cage bearings. They can all be hardened steel, and they can make the bearings larger and sit where they want rather than where they go in the factory transmission. The billet casing is more rigid than the factory case due to the ribbing and obviously the material itself, which is beneficial in high horsepower applications, especially over 1,000 horsepower, as the 4-wheel drive launch on drag radials combined with big power can actually flex the factory casing. If the factory casing flexes, it can obviously distort the journals from where the shafts run, and the gears may wear irregularly or potentially over time can even break from having the wrong contact patch. Now, this billet casing has a smaller profile, so it's actually easier to install and remove from the car, which is great, and allows for more room around it for plumbing the cooler lines. The billet case also acts as a better heat sink, as the material will give off heat better than the factory OEM box. It has inspection portholes, so you don't have to tear it down to have a quick look inside. The Billet Sequential also has provisions for various sensors, such as input and output speed sensors, which can help with shift strategies, oil temperature sensor, and a condition sensor, which measures the amount of material in the oil and can give an indication of wear and can even pick up on an issue before a catastrophic failure. It has dual pickups for the oil drain, which allows for oil cooler plumbing on either side of the transmission. The return from the oil cooler is on the front of the gearbox, so it sprays oil back in after the oil pump, and it keeps oil up the front during heavy acceleration. It has a stronger snout for the clutch bearing. It uses an electric lockout solenoid instead of a cable lockout, which has better feel and is easier to use with the button on top of the gear lever. The shifter is different and has a shorter throw for quicker shifts due to a different pivot ratio. With all those changes, it's still a bolt-in item with an RB bell housing pattern and the Nissan transfer case bolting straight on, and still uses the factory gearbox crossmember. So how do you choose the right option for your Skyline GT-R? Well, firstly, one argument is if you don't want to wreck your factory gearbox that's in good condition, or you don't have a gearbox, that you would buy the billet one. But here's the thing, if you have a perfectly good gearbox you don't want to wreck, you still need to take the transfer case off it. If you have a blown gearbox that you've bought with a transfer case, that's the perfect option, because if you don't have a gearbox to begin with, you still got to find a transfer case, right? And the problem is, a blown gearbox with a transfer case is the same price as a transfer case. So if you have a perfectly good gearbox you don't want to wreck, well, just pull the gear set out and sell it to someone later with a broken gearbox if you want to, so you can still use the casing for this. So all of that stuff aside, how do you choose between the two? Well, I can only give you my opinion based on having my car, having built the throttle GT-R with the Billet Sequential in it, and information given to me by PPG. Personally, I would use the OEM casing with a gear set for a street car that makes 1,000 horsepower or less. You don't need all the oil coolers and everything else, and you can get away with that. The moment you want to do any circuit racing, I would switch to the Billet so that you can have an oil cooler built in. You've got the sensors for wear and tear. Now, if your car makes over 1,000 horsepower, I would be using the Billet gearbox option, just like we are. Regardless of which sequential transmission you install in your car, one thing you should do when you do it is get your transfer case inspected, freshened up, or potentially upgraded. Now, PPG actually do offer this service, and the transfer case on my Sequential was done by them back in 2017 and has worked perfectly ever since. The one that I've got here, though, was built by Sean from Gearbox Masters and has also been upgraded to have 10 clutches. Now, before we talk any more about that, let's talk about how these transfer cases actually work. Obviously, the output shaft comes in to the back of the box, goes through. You can see the chain that goes down to where the drive shaft goes up to the front diff, which sits in the sump, and then you obviously have your clutches that are basically determine how much power goes to the front. Now, the four-wheel drive ECU, the Atessa system, basically controls solenoids with feedback from TPS, G sensors and ABS sensors to determine how much pressure, hydraulic pressure, to push onto the back of this plunger. Usually there's a line here that goes back up to the solenoids, but essentially hydraulic pressure goes in here, pushes onto like a fork that pushes onto the clutch plate, which basically acts like a normal clutch for the gearbox. And obviously, the more pressure you put on, the more clamping force, the more torque can be transferred through those clutches to go to the front. People always say, how much power goes to the front of a GT-R? Well, in theory, it's 100% two-wheel drive until you apply any throttle or have any cornering force applied due to the G sensors or have any traction lost that you detect through the ABS sensors. It's a pretty complicated algorithm, and as you modify the car, it can change. It can also change, obviously, by having more plates in the clutch packs inside this, but basically, a stock GT-R might only get 30% to the front on hard acceleration, but a highly modified one with 1,000 plus horsepower could go 50%. But like I said, there's so many variables that basically all I can say to you is up to 50% power can go to the front. That's it. Very complicated algorithm with the Atessa all-wheel drive system. So if you want to upgrade your transfer case, you essentially add more clutch plates. Ours now has 10 clutch plates in it, which means it'll actually bring power in earlier as it starts to engage, and obviously able to handle more power, because a broken transfer case is a whole bunch of broken dreams in a GT-R, as you no longer have the four-wheel drive advantage. So we now need to get our transfer case from Gearbox Masters attached to the back of our Billet 6-speed Sequential, get it in the car, and show you guys just how good it is before we race it at GT-R Challenge, GT-R Festival Sydney, before we take it to the US. And we're coming to race all of you Americans watching right now. Let's go.